the paper we're doing is called Population, Food and Knowledge by Johnson Gale. This paper attempts to explain the reasons behind why the population increase was not restricted through limitations imposed by nature. So he first delves into a little bit of history about food and population growth, focusing on the Malthusian trap. As early as 200 AD, Quintus Turlanus wrote, "We are a burden to the world, the resources scarcely adequate to us, and complaints are everywhere while nature does not sustain us." Malthus has a generally pessimistic view of the population. He believes that it has a tendency to outrun the available food supply and was checked by disease and starvation. He later corrected this view and noted a desire for self-improvement, mainly seen through an increase in the age of marriage, which he believed would impact population growth, but still not to the extent we have seen today. This pessimistic view was justified for a majority of the world, but looking at data, we can see that there has been a huge increase in population and an increase in well-being in both food and quality of life. This is seen through fewer famines, increased caloric intake, reduced infant mortality, increased life expectancy, and much more. For example, real-world output in the 1980s was more than 10 times the output in the 1820s, whereas the real-world output in the 1990s was significantly larger at 40 times the 1820 level. So what made it possible for Europe to escape this Malthusian trap? His answer is the creation of knowledge, which allowed people to offset the limitations that the natural world imposed. This includes the development of new technologies at an unprecedented rate and findings of low cost and abundant substitutes for natural resources in production processes. Although people have not found a way to overcome diminishing marginal returns, improved amounts of productivity and human capital have been enough to push us out of this Malthusian trap. So in this paper, he emphasizes three major factors responsible for the period of economic growth that has allowed the population to far exceed food limitations. The first factor is the advantages in agricultural productivity in the 18th and 19th century. With an increase in agricultural productivity, it allowed people to focus on development of cities and furthering economic growth. The second factor is the increase in knowledge coming from increasing populations and rising real per capita income. The increase in real income allows for allocation of resources to the creation of knowledge. In particular, the development of two institutions, universities, and research. And lastly, the third factor is the response of families to the removal of the natural constraints. The Malthusian idea is that households respond to an increase in food supply due to agricultural development and knowledge by increasing fertility rates and driving up population until it is once again held in check through famine or disease. But in reality, we see that households did not increase fertility rates, and in fact, the population growth was from a mortality decline. So first, we look at the impact of the evolution of agriculture until the 19th century on life expectancy, urbanization, and growth of world population. It was not until the 17th century that we saw evidence that life expectancy was increasing. In Europe, the average life expectancy in 1725 was around 30 years, but by the 1800s, it increased to around 35. In addition, in the 1700s, daily caloric supplies were an average of 2,095 for England and 1,657 for France, but these increased over 10% in the next century. Although there most likely would have been other factors that played a role, improved nutritional intake was significant. Now looking at urbanization, it can be seen that it stayed relatively constant until the latter half of the 18th century and dramatically increased in the 19th. In the 18th century, urban population of Europe was only 12.2%, and by the 19th century, it was 37.9% of Europe's population. The development of cities became possible only after farmers increased production relative to their own consumption. And lastly, we look at the growth of the world population. Evidence of a slow increase in per capita output of agriculture can be seen in the comparably slow growth of the world population. In the years ending in the 1700s, the population growth rate was 0.12%, a doubling time of 580 years. Not over a century later, the rate of population growth increased to 0.41%, with a doubling time of 179 years. Without the significant increase in food production, the increase in population would not have occurred. So now we turn to the Industrial Revolution, which began in England in the 1750s. Up until now, the share of England's population had remained relatively constant, with available food supply staying at relatively similar growth levels as the population. We see in the Industrial Revolution an increase in the productivity of labor in agriculture, large enough for labor to transfer into cities and out of agriculture. In the mid 1700s, population growth rate was seemingly static, growing at only 0.1%. By the latter half of the 1700s, the growth rate increased by 50%, and in the next half century, the population almost doubled, with nearly all of this increase being urban. So, what increased the productivity in agriculture? Yield increases are significantly associated with an increase in labor productivity. There was an increase in high-yielding crops such as corn and potatoes, and the cultivation of turnips, which would increase the availability of manure. This allowed for higher crop yields and more productive methods of fertilizing the soil. Also, the enclosure movement changed publicly owned land, usually for cattle grazing, to privately owned land, allowing for more productive use. In addition, there was an elimination of fallow through crop rotation, allowing farmers to restore soil fertility and produce higher yields. Amongst many more examples, the increase in per capita food production and labor productivity allowed for the increase in population to be sustained with an increase in food production. As well, the growth in productivity required less share of labor to be devoted to farming, allowing more to be devoted to productive uses and the accumulation of further knowledge.
The mechanical revolution. Throughout history, grain has provided the major source of our energies. Roughly 75 to 80% of the calories that we consume come from grain. For hundreds of years, until the 19th century, grain was harvested using the same methods with the sickle, the scythe, and the cradle. And we can see those three farm implements on the left-hand side. They were handheld, and getting the harvest in was arduous, time-consuming, and painful. The invention and introduction of the reaper in 1831 in America changed all that. The reaper was soon followed by the binder. Both of those can be seen on the right-hand side of the blue-green arrow, which was a reaper with an attachment that brought the grain straw together in a bundle and tied it up with twine. Both of those farm implements were used for roughly 100 years to bring in the harvest until they too were eclipsed by the modern combine that we can see on the right-hand side. The long existing bottleneck that harvesting had been was now eliminated. Harnessing the power of the internal combustion engine also led to the creation of the tractor. The labor savings of the mechanical revolution were enormous. It is estimated that the direct labor input used to produce a ton of grain in the United States declined by 70% in the 1800s. Land was not the scarce resource. Throughout most of human history, lack of good land for crops has not been a significant issue that limited agricultural production. The primary factor that limited agricultural production was labor. Farmers could scarcely supply for their own needs, much less for trading purposes. Until the 1800s, yields were calculated by unit per seed. Land was not a consideration in this equation. Esther Boswell, who has written on the topic, states that land only recently became the limiting factor in food production. Farmers changed their techniques. They moved away from slash and burn to shorter or slash even no fallow periods. They increased the use of fertilization, etc. This change in technique was due to the change in knowledge that the farmers had, and it was also often informal knowledge that they had gained through years of experience working the land. The huge increase in knowledge fueled the manifold increase in output over the last 200 years, both informal, as I just talked about, but also the more formal types of knowledge. What is the source of this gain in knowledge? Number one, growth in population levels, and number two, the increase in per capita incomes. Michael Kramer writes that larger population leads to greater knowledge by increasing the benefits of knowledge and allowing more individuals to spend their lives making important discoveries. This is very closely related to the increase in per capita incomes argument that as the quality of life increased, it allowed for these individuals to absorb the implicit and explicit costs of gaining this knowledge. Improvements in agriculture, expansion of the cities, and explosion of income per capita led to institutions specifically designed to transmit knowledge. Universities and research institutions have played a huge role in knowledge accumulation in the 1800s when 80 to 85% of the world was engaged in agriculture and many others produced non-food items. Very few were left to acquire new knowledge. By 1990, only a tenth of the population in the developed world worked in agriculture. This number was 60% for the developing world, despite a sevenfold increase in population over the 190 years between these two stats. This just shows that the mechanical evolution, the advancements made in agriculture, and the increase in knowledge allowed for a huge increase in population, but a smaller proportion of the population to care for the food needs of the now larger world population. In 1870, these stats are from the United States, 563 universities, 5,553 faculty, 52,000 students, which isn't that much larger than Western. Only one PhD was awarded. Fast forward 125 years, 915,000 faculty, 14.3 million students, and 43,000 PhDs were awarded in that year. These numbers, of course, have only increased over the last 26 years. The explosion in education and research was aided post-World War II by the government, which no longer needed to focus investment on agriculture or the military, as they had now won the war and could now focus on education and research.
Part 7. Effects of birth rates on mortality and global population. Johnson's third factor is that quality of life and not birth rate increases actually led to population growth in developed countries in the 19th and developing countries in the 20th centuries. If one looks at this graph next to the image here, one might notice that life expectancy from birth increased substantially. So in effect, Johnson is arguing that it isn't the Malthusian argument that births increase exponentially that happened, but instead that population growth has in large part been fueled by people living longer. Resources were therefore not dispersed to sustain ever-growing populations, but instead allowed the capital-intensive growth that he presented in his previous points with regard to cities, education, etc. To back this point, he looks first at developed countries, where, according to Kieftz and Flieger, declining fertility rates in the 19th century went from about 4.7 child per mother to 1.9 in 1990. Meanwhile, though, life expectancy increases substantially from 34 years in 1780 to 54 years in 1910 and to over 70 years at present. A minor fertility increase did occur early in the Industrial Revolution, but not of any substantial nature. In developing countries, according to the UNDP, they saw about a 38% fertility decline in the 38 least developed countries between 1960 and 1995. So why did population increase? Well, population increased because life expectancy increased from 42 to 59 over the same period, with deaths declining by far more than births. 31.5% decline for deaths versus a 14.4% decline for births. This, of course, excludes China, which had very specific social policies which led to a very different result in that country. Children, in fact, are the reason why this change occurred. Children moved from breadwinners in a social insurance program for parents by ensuring resources in parents' old age, by having net positive values as farm workers, to commodity goods, which would be picked by parents according to just how many children they would have. Children moved from resource to consumption good. In Part 8, Johnson compares population growth in the 19th and 20th centuries. About 0.8% between 1880 and 1900 compared to 2% between 1950 and 1995. And yes, why did the 19th century see lower population growth than the 20th century if we were to consider first developing and developed countries? Well, he argues that this is in part due to lower real GDP growth rates in the 19th century. He argues that it's due to urban migration and the fact that people were moving to cities, which were not a very beautiful space. He also argues that this was due to child mortality. And finally, he argues that it's due to different intercepts in birth rates. Birth rates have been declining both in the 19th century in developed countries and in the 20th century in developing countries, but simply started at different levels. The birth rate in 1800 in Germany is probably significantly lower than the birth rate in 1950 Ethiopia, to give an example. Probably by up to 4 or 5 points. Because of that, the comparison might show that, and this is Johnson's point, that the 20th century sees much bigger progress than one might give it credit for. And he highlights this in The Myth of the City. In 1890, in New York City, infant mortality was 26.4%. In the rural United States, infant mortality was 12.1%. And in Bombay, to give the extreme, in 1900, birth mortality was 60%. Johnson notes that in the 19th century, cities increased in population only due to influxes from the outside. The idea of cities as more developed than rural areas is a very, very recent concept brought about by this concentration of wealth, concentration of resources in the city, which cost the human population a significant amount over time. Again, in the 19th centuries, cities had a higher death rate than birth rate, and only sustained their population through people coming into the cities. Johnson's ninth part to the paper highlights how there has been a slight difference between the 19th century growth of developed countries and the 20th century growth of developing countries. And that is in the widespread distribution of benefits of modernity. The goods of progress have been widely distributed in the 20th century. There is, of course, inequality. There is significant inequality, even growing inequality, but that doesn't mean a lack of growth for the lower levels of the standard. It simply means that a differentiated rate of growth. And today, in the 20th century, this growth affects 4.84 billion people in the developing world. That's a 350% increase in population over a century, compared to an only 85% increase in 19th century Europe. And this is the interesting point. Growth and amelioration in goods, which I would relate to a quote by Johnson right next to here, has been achieved at a much lower per capita income level in developing countries than in developed countries. In fact, the benefits of water, sanitation, etc. cost more to discover and normalize, imagine in 19th century Europe, than to export later to developing countries in the 20th century. Johnson overall describes as this way. Improvements in the conditions of life, in terms of nutrition, infant mortality, and life expectancy, have occurred at a much faster pace in the developing countries in the 20th century than in the developed countries in the 19th century. Basically, Johnson is stating that information transmission has made the development of developing countries in the 20th century much simpler than that of developed countries in the 19th. And he highlights this, of course, through the global increase in calorie supply, noting that per capita food supply in developing countries, which represent 80% of the world's population, has increased by 50%, notwithstanding a doubling of said population between 1948 and 1996. This is incredible compared to the small 4 or 5% increases in productivity of developed nations during the 19th century. 90% of production also remains domestic in developing countries, which is interesting because it highlights that this isn't production coming from developed countries. And secondly, he notes that technology to quadruple output in this way, 50% increase in output, doubling of the population, quadrupling of output, did not exist in the 19th century and was not possible for developed countries to do. In fact, overall, global food expenditure decreased substantially. Taking the US as an example, that's from 70% in 1900 to 10% today. Part 10. Johnson's conclusion. Overall, Johnson concludes that the growth and quality of life in developing nations in the 20th century far outpaced that of developed nations in the 19th century, and avoided Malthusian traps such as those notably in this in this graph, which I'm covering with my face, which might have been hit at the point of crisis, where population would have exploded much faster than resource growth. Because of this, he argues 3 points overall came to this effect. First, substantial increases in productivity, output, and food production specifically, which were not available in the 19th century, were available in the 20th. Second, through a surplus of allocation to knowledge production, which allowed the growth of cities beyond this 19th century ideal of poverty, which one might have read in Victor Hugo, for example, but which we saw in the previous slides was not as idyllic as one might believe. And finally, through a limited growth in birth rates, which maintained population growth within limits, and which led most of population growth to occur through decreases in death rates, the result has been that we've avoided this point of crisis. We've avoided this inflection point where population explodes way above the level of resources which its environment can carry. There are enough resources because technology has facilitated that growth, and humans have not grown at the rate which might otherwise have been feared they would. And with that, thank you for listening to our presentation.